The bidding ended at $2. I remember the silence that followed. Thick, almost solid, like fog you could press your fingers into. The auctioneer's gavel hit the wood, and the sound cracked through the hall like something breaking. Maybe it was my dignity. Maybe it was the last fragile thing I'd been holding on to since the night my pack left me behind. $2. I didn't cry. I'd used up every tear I had 3 years before, standing at the edge of the Duskwood territory with nothing but the clothes on my back and a name that no longer belonged to any pack. Crying required believing something better was possible. I had stopped believing in that long before I was placed on a wooden platform in the center of the Varek trading hall, hands folded in front of me, eyes fixed on a point just above the crowd's heads. The hall smelled of pine resin, candle smoke, and old stone. It was large enough to hold 200 wolves, and on this night, nearly all of them had come. Alphas, betas, their mates, their advisors. They lined the tiered benches with furs draped over their shoulders and goblets in their hands, speaking in low voices about border territories and breeding rights and pack alliances. The kind of conversations that decided the fates of people like me without ever once asking our names. I was the last one sold that evening. The others before me had gone quickly. A pair of young unmated Omegas from the Greymere pack fetched 60 silver marks between them. An older woman, quiet and skilled with herbs, went to a healer's house in the northern reaches for 30. A young man with a strong build and steady eyes was purchased for pack labor at 45. Each time the gavel fell, I watched their shoulders change, the tension of waiting replaced by something else. Not relief, exactly. More like resignation settling into a new shape. Then it was my turn. I walked up the 3 steps to the platform without being pushed. That was important to me, even then. Whatever this was, I would face it standing straight. My braid, pale gold, a little frayed at the end, hung over one shoulder. My cloak was clean, at least. I had scrubbed it with river water the morning before, in the cold, with hands that had gone numb before I finished. The auctioneer, a heavy-jawed beta named Oren, didn't bother reading much from the scroll. He glanced at it, then at me, and his expression said everything the crowd was already thinking. Unmated, no pack affiliation, no recorded skills. Omega classification, secondary tier. That was the polite way of saying it. The ruder version moved through the hall in whispers I wasn't meant to hear but did, because Omegas always hear more than anyone expects. Feral cast-off. Probably unstable. Why would she be unaffiliated at her age if something wasn't wrong with her? I was 23. To them, that was already an answer. The bidding opened at 15 marks. No one raised a hand. Oren dropped it to 10, then to 5. He made a small joke about it, something about a bargain, and a few people in the back laughed. Not loudly, but enough. 3 marks, 2 marks, 1 mark. Silence so complete I could hear the candles guttering in their iron holders. Then, from the back of the hall, not from the benches, but from the shadowed archway where the doors opened onto the cold night, a voice. $2. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. There was something in the timbre of it that reached every corner of the hall without effort. The way a stone dropped in still water moves the entire surface. Low and even, and utterly unbothered, as if the speaker had simply decided the matter and was informing the room as a courtesy. Every head turned. Mine did too. He stood in the archway with 2 other men flanking him, large, well-armed, expressionless. But I barely registered them. My eyes went straight to the man in the center, and something inside my chest did something I couldn't name. Not fear, though there was an edge of that. Not attraction, though I was not blind. Something older than either. Something that felt almost like recognition, which made no sense at all, because I had never seen this man in my life. He was tall enough that the archway framed him almost exactly. Dark braids pulled back from a face that was angular and still, with eyes so pale and sharp they caught the candlelight from 40 feet away. He wore leather and fur, practical and without ornamentation, but the two wolves beside him wore the silver-threaded black of the Caerwyn Royal Guard. The hall had gone completely silent. Oren the auctioneer made a sound in his throat. "My lord," he started, then stopped, then tried again. The currency of bidding tonight is silver marks, not—" $2, the man said again, the same way, not repeating himself, finishing the sentence Oren hadn't managed to complete. He reached into his coat and placed something on the narrow table beside the door. I was too far away to see what, exactly, but I heard the thin metallic sound of it, small and almost absurd against the enormous weight of the moment. Oren looked at the table. He looked at the man. He looked at the crowd, searching for someone to tell him what to do, which told me immediately that this man outranked everyone in the room, including Oren's own alpha employer, who sat in the third row and had gone very, very still. "Sold," Oren said. The gavel came down. I stood on the platform and breathed. $2, the price of a cup of tea in a common house. The price of a bundle of candles or a handful of nails at a market stall. The price that the Varek Trading Hall, in its collective and unspoken agreement, had assigned to Mabel of Nopak, Omega of secondary tier, age 23, no recorded skills. The price this man had paid without hesitation, without negotiation, without even walking fully into the room. I stepped off the platform. My knees held. I was proud of that. A woman appeared at my side, mid-40s, dark-haired, efficient, wearing the same silver-threaded black as the guards. She didn't grab my arm or push me. She simply fell into step beside me and spoke in a low, businesslike voice. "Your travel arrangements will be explained. You are not in any danger. Please walk with me." I almost laughed at that. Please. Because in my experience, the word please had been used on Omegas roughly never in a context that included a genuine choice. But I walked. As I passed through the hall, the crowd parted. Not for me, of course. For him. He had turned and was already moving back through the archway into the dark, and people stepped aside the way water steps aside for a ship's hull. Automatically, without thought, because there was simply no other option. I passed within 6 feet of him. He didn't look at me. Or, I thought he didn't. But just as I crossed the threshold into the cold night air, something made me glance back over my shoulder. Some pressure at the back of my neck like a hand that wasn't there. He was looking at me. Not the way the men in the hall had looked at me, measuring, dismissing, calculating worth and finding it absent. He was looking at me the way someone looks at a thing they have been searching for a long time and are not yet sure they have truly found. Then the door closed between us, and the night swallowed the light, and I stood in the cold with my gray cloak and my fraying braid and the echo of a gavel still ringing in my ears. $2. I didn't know yet what he'd bought exactly. I wasn't sure he did either. The cart that carried me north was covered and warm, which I hadn't expected. There were 2 blankets folded on the bench, real wool, not the rough woven kind, and a small lantern that swung gently with the movement of the road. The woman who had walked me out, who introduced herself simply as Wren, sat across from me with a leather satchel in her lap, and the calm, organized energy of someone who managed large and complicated things for a living. She told me without preamble that the man who had purchased me was Cassian, Alpha King of the Caerwyn territories, ruler of the 5 northern packs, and the most feared wolf on the continent. She said it the way someone might say the weather tomorrow will be cold, as if it were simply a fact of the landscape, to be acknowledged and moved past. I stared at the lantern flame for a long moment. "Why?" I asked. Wren opened her satchel. "He'll explain." "You don't know?" She looked up at me with eyes that had clearly seen a great deal, and were not easily rattled. "I know many things," she said. "Whether to share them isn't always my decision." Outside, the forest thickened. The road climbed. The cold deepened. I pulled one of the wool blankets around my shoulders and watched the dark trees move past the cart's small window, and I thought about the way he had looked at me. That searching, unresolved look. The look of someone holding a question they hadn't yet decided how to ask. I had been unwanted my entire life. I had no idea what to do with someone who had sought me out. The Carewind stronghold appeared through the trees just before dawn. I had dozed against the cart wall somewhere in the middle of the night, lulled by the rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the steady creak of the wheels. When I opened my eyes, the first gray light was pressing through the window glass, and the forest had given way to open highland, wide, pale, swept with a wind that moved the tall grasses in slow, rolling waves like something breathing. And then the walls rose. Stone, dark and old, fitted together with the kind of permanence that said we were here before you, and we will be here after. Towers at each corner, torches still burning against the retreating dark. A gate wide enough for 4 horses abreast, flanked by guards who stood without shifting, their breath making small clouds in the cold morning air. I pressed my fingers against the cart window without meaning to. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the feeling of scale, of realizing that the world you had been surviving in was actually very small, and that something much larger had just opened its gates to you, and that you had no map for what came next. The cart rolled through without stopping. The guards didn't check it. They simply stepped aside, eyes forward, and the gate swallowed us whole. Inside, the stronghold was already awake. That surprised me. I had imagined a place like this sleeping late, wrapped in its own importance. Instead, there were stable hands crossing the yard with buckets, a pair of women carrying baskets of bread from what smelled like a bakehouse on the eastern side, 2 young men sparring near the far wall with the focused, unhurried energy of people who did this every morning as a matter of course. A dog, enormous, gray-muzzled, moving slowly, lifted its head as we passed, and then set it back down on its paws with the serene indifference of the very old. Wren led me inside through a side entrance, up a staircase that smelled of beeswax and old wood, and into a room that stopped me in the doorway. It was not large. That was the first thing. I had expected grandeur, high ceilings, cold stone, the performative emptiness of power. This room had a low ceiling with exposed beams, a fireplace already burning, a window that looked out over the highland grass. There was a bed with an iron frame, a washstand, a small table with a chair. On the table, a candle, a cup of water, a folded linen cloth. Someone had prepared this room recently. The fire was fresh. The water was not stale. "Rest," Wren said. "He will speak with you this afternoon. There is no schedule before that. You are not required to be anywhere." I turned to look at her. Is there a lock on this door?" She met my eyes steadily. "From the inside, yes. Not from the outside." I nodded slowly, processing that. "Mabel." She said my name carefully, like she was confirming she had it right. "I have worked for Cassian for 11 years. In that time I have seen him make decisions that confuse people greatly, and I have watched those decisions prove correct more often than not. I cannot explain this one to you yet, but I can tell you that no one in this stronghold will harm you." She paused. "You have my word on that, and I do not give it lightly." She left. I stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, listening to the fire breathe. Then I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was real, stuffed with something soft, not straw, and I pressed my palms flat on my thighs and I let myself feel, for just a moment, how exhausted I was. Not just from the night's travel, from the years before it. From 3 years of borderline existence, moving between territories that tolerated me briefly before making clear I was not welcome. From the particular weariness of being someone that no one chooses. I did not cry, but I sat with it for a while, the weight of it, the way it lived in my shoulders and the back of my jaw. Then I washed my face, rebraided my hair, and waited. He received me in the library. I was brought there by a young man named Petra, slight, quick-moving, with the careful politeness of someone trained to make people comfortable. And as he opened the heavy door, I had a moment to take in the room before anything else registered. Books, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, dark wood shelves packed so tightly the spines blurred into a single texture. Maps spread across the central table, weighted at the corners with smooth stones. A globe of dark glass near the window. 2 leather chairs angled toward the fire, and behind the larger one. Standing rather than sitting. Hands clasped at his back, and eyes on the gray highland beyond the glass. Cassian. He turned when I entered, and I made myself hold his gaze, which was harder than I had anticipated. Not because of what I expected to see, coldness, authority, the blank assessment of a man who measured everything, but because of what I didn't. Up close, in daylight, without the dramatic weight of that archway and that hall, he looked tired, not weak. Nothing about him suggested weakness. But the tiredness was real, settled into the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw, the tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "Mabel," he said. "Cassian," I said, and then immediately wondered if that was a catastrophic breach of protocol. Something moved through his expression, not quite amusement but adjacent to it, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth. "Sit down," he said. "Please." I sat. He remained standing for a moment, then seemed to decide against the performance of it, and took the chair across from me. We looked at each other. "I imagine," he said, "you have questions." "Several hundred," I said. "I thought I'd start with the obvious one. Why? Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. He didn't look away or rearrange himself. He simply seemed to be deciding how much of the truth to offer, the way careful people do when the full truth is large, and the moment is still fragile. "I have a daughter," he said. Whatever I had expected him to say, it was not that. "She is 7 years old. Her name is Sable. Her mother—" He paused, just a fraction. "Her mother is gone. Has been gone for 2 years. He did not elaborate, and I did not ask. "Sable she is not an easy child to reach. She stopped speaking for several months after. She has started again, but only to certain people, and mostly in monosyllables. My healers tell me she is physically well. My advisors tell me she will adapt. My beta tells me she needs time." He stopped. "She is 7 years old and she flinches when people raise their voices, and she hasn't laughed since she was 5. I do not know what she needs. I know that what I have been able to provide so far has not been enough." The fire crackled between us. "I have been looking," he continued, "for some time, for an omega with particular qualities. Patience, steadiness. Someone who has known difficulty without being destroyed by it. Someone who understands what it is to be small in a large and complicated world." He looked at me directly. "I was told about you 6 weeks ago by someone who had encountered you in the Fenwick territories. They described you as the calmest person they had ever seen in an impossible situation. I thought about the Fenwick territories, about a flooded bridge, and a terrified group of packless wolves, and the 3 hours I had spent talking people through a crossing one at a time, in the rain, when the water was at our knees and rising. I was just the one who could swim," I said. "You stayed until everyone was across," he said. "Then you kept going, alone, in the wrong direction, to make sure no one had been left upstream." I didn't answer. "I'm not looking for a servant," he said, "or a governess in the formal sense. I'm looking for someone who can simply be present with her, consistently, without an agenda." He leaned forward slightly, forearms on his knees, In return, you would have safety, a wage, a place here for as long as you choose to stay. And when, if, you decide to leave, you leave with the full backing of this house. No one will turn you away from a territory if you carry care when standing. The room was very quiet. The auction, I said. The $2. Something shifted in his expression. The bidding system at Varek is... I have opinions about it that I will pursue through proper channels in due time. I was not there to participate in it. I was there because my contact told me you were scheduled to come through, and I did not know another way to ensure your departure with me would be uncontested. He said the last word with a flatness that told me the uncontested part had been a real concern. The amount was irrelevant. I would have paid any amount. I chose that one as a statement. I thought about the silence after that gavel fell. The way every alpha in that hall had gone still. A statement, indeed. Can I meet her first? I asked. Before I decide. He blinked. It was the first time I had seen anything crack his composure, just slightly. Yes, he said after a moment. Of course. I stood. He stood. We were closer than I expected. The chairs had been near the fire, and the fire was small, and the room, for all its books and its maps and its dark authority, was not large. I looked up at him, and he looked down at me, and there was that thing again. That pressure I had no word for. Recognition without origin. The sense of a question neither of us had formed yet. I'll need my own space, I said. And I'll need people to stop calling me secondary tier. His jaw tightened, not at me, at the phrase. Done, he said. I nodded once. Then let me meet Sable. Sable was sitting on the floor of the eastern corridor when Petra led me to her. Not in a room, not at a table with toys arranged around her, or books open in her lap the way children in important houses were supposed to sit. She was on the stone floor of the corridor itself, back against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, watching a spider build something intricate and unhurried in the corner, where the wall met the ceiling. She had her father's dark coloring. Brown skin, black hair that curled slightly at the ends, and had clearly escaped whatever arrangement someone had tried to put it in that morning. She was small for 7, or at least she seemed small, folded into herself the way she was. She didn't look up when we approached. Petra crouched slightly. Sable, this is... I put my hand on his arm, gently, and he stopped. I didn't crouch down or make myself deliberately small or use the particular careful voice that adults use on wounded children. That soft, cautious tone that always sounds like what it is, which is management. I simply sat down on the floor beside her, back against the wall, knees up, and looked at the spider. It was doing something genuinely impressive with a corner junction, running lines at angles that shouldn't have worked structurally but did. We sat in silence for a while. Petra hovered in the corridor behind us, uncertain, and I heard him shift his weight twice before he seemed to decide that whatever was happening was not an emergency, and retreated to a respectful distance. The spider finished one line and started another. She's building a funnel, I said eventually. Not to Sable specifically, just into the air between us. The flat part at the top is the trap. The narrow part leads down to where she waits. Very efficient design. Silence. Then, small and careful, a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used much lately. She. I glanced sideways. Sable was still looking at the spider, but something in her posture had changed. A tiny loosening, like a fist opening one finger at a time. Could be a he, I said. Hard to tell from here. But funnel weavers are usually female. They do most of the architectural work. Another silence. Longer this time, but different in texture. Less closed. What happens when something gets caught? She asked. She comes up very fast from the bottom and, well, she deals with it. Sable considered this with the seriousness of someone filing it away. Does it hurt? The thing that gets caught. Probably not for long, I said. Spiders are efficient. She nodded slowly, still watching the ceiling. We sat there for another 10 minutes, the three of us, me, Sable, and the spider going about her business with complete indifference to the significance of the moment. When Petra eventually came to tell Sable it was time for her afternoon meal, she stood without argument, which he later told me was unusual. At the door of the corridor, she stopped and looked back at me, still on the floor. "The spider will probably be gone tomorrow," she said. "They move a lot." "Then we'll find another one," I said. She looked at me for a long moment with her father's pale, sharp eyes and her mother's softer face. Then she turned and walked away. I sat on the cold stone floor for another moment, alone, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I'll stay, I thought, at least for a while. The weeks that followed had a rhythm I hadn't experienced in years. Structure without rigidity, purpose without performance. I was given a room, the same small one from the first night, which I came to understand was a deliberate choice, not an oversight. Wren told me, with her characteristic efficiency, that Cassian had specifically chosen it because it was warm, had a good lock, and was near the eastern corridor where Sable spent most of her time. He had thought about it. That detail lodged itself somewhere in my chest and stayed there. My days organized themselves around Sable without being formally assigned to her. That distinction mattered. I was not her keeper. I was not her teacher, her therapist, her guardian. I was simply someone who showed up consistently in places she already was. I learned her patterns. She rose early and went directly to the kitchens, where the head cook, a broad, flour-dusted woman named Greta who spoke exclusively in declarative sentences and had strong opinions about soup, always had something warm set aside for her without comment. Sable ate alone at the small kitchen table while Greta worked, and neither of them seemed to require conversation, which I thought said something admirable about both of them. After the third morning, I started appearing in the kitchen at the same time. Greta set a second cup down, without looking up from her bread dough. "You take honey or not?" "Not," I said. She nodded once, as if I had passed some preliminary assessment. Sable watched me from across the table with careful eyes, and I drank my tea and read from the book I'd borrowed from the library. A dry, detailed text about Highland fauna that was actually surprisingly engaging, and did not attempt conversation, and after a while she went back to her porridge. That was how it started. Mornings in the kitchen, then afternoons in the corridors and the eastern courtyard, where Sable had discovered a population of the small gray lizards that sunned themselves on the warm stones. Then, after 2 weeks, evenings, because she started appearing at the door of my room just before dark, not asking for anything specific, just standing there until I moved aside to let her in, and then sitting on the window seat while I read or wrote in the small journal I'd been given with the room's supplies. She started talking, slowly, in the way water finds cracks in stone, not forcing, just finding the available space and moving into it. I learned that she was afraid of thunderstorms not because of the sound, but because of the darkness that came before them. I learned that she had a particular fondness for maps, inherited apparently from her father, and could spend an hour tracing mountain ranges with her finger with complete absorption. I learned that she had decided, at some point in the past 2 years, that being very quiet and very still was the safest way to exist, and that she applied this strategy to everything including mealtimes, lessons, and the large formal gatherings that Cassian occasionally required her to attend. I understood that strategy. I had used a version of it myself. "It's exhausting, isn't it?" I said one evening, not quite a question. "Being that careful all the time." She looked up from the map she'd spread across her knees. "Yes," she said very simply. And then, after a pause, "Does it stop?" I thought about lying, about offering the comfortable reassurance that adults offer children when the true answer is too complicated. Then I thought about what it had felt like when adults lied to me at her age, and how I had always known, and how it had made the truth feel even more frightening by contrast. "It gets quieter," I said. "You get better at knowing when you actually need it, and when you're just running the habit." She absorbed this, nodded, went back to the map. That night, after she'd been walked back to her rooms by Petra, I sat by my window and thought about Cassian, about the way he appeared at the edges of these days, never intruding, never demanding reports, but present in small ways. A book left outside my door that addressed something I'd mentioned in passing. A word with Greta that resulted in the kitchen fire being built higher on cold mornings. Instructions given to the guards that resulted in the eastern courtyard being cleared of training drills during the hours Sable and I were usually there. He was paying attention. Quietly, without making a production of it. It made me more uncomfortable than outright attention would have. Outright attention I knew how to deflect. This kind, careful, considerate, operating entirely through small acts that could each be explained away individually. This kind I had no established defense against. We had our first real conversation 3 weeks after my arrival, in the library, late at night. I hadn't been able to sleep and had come for a book, and he was there at the central table with maps and correspondence spread around him, and the particular stillness of a man who had been sitting alone for hours. He looked up when I entered, and neither of us pretended the other wasn't there. "Sit," he said. Not a command, more like an offering. I sat across the table from him, and he pushed a small plate of sliced bread and soft cheese toward me without comment, and I took some because I was hungry, and there was something disarming about the plainness of the gesture. "How is she?" he asked, and I noticed that he didn't specify. He didn't need to. "She's finding her edges again," I said. "Testing what's safe. She'll get louder before she gets easier. That's usually how it goes." He looked at the maps. Something moved through his expression. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. "You don't have to know how," I said. "That's not actually what she needs from you." He looked up. "She needs you to stay," I said. "That's all. Just keep being there, in the kitchen, at the table, in the corridor when she walks past, not doing anything specific, just not leaving." The fire between us settled lower, shifting from flame to deep glowing coal. He was quiet for a long time. "Is that what you needed?" he asked finally. "When you were small?" The question caught me completely off guard. Not because it was intrusive. It wasn't. It was asked with the same careful, non-demanding quality as everything else about him. But because no one had ever asked me that before. Not once. "Yes," I said, after a moment. He nodded slowly, like someone receiving information they intended to use. Outside the library window, the highland dark pressed close and cold, and inside, the fire breathed, and neither of us said anything else for a while, and somehow that was enough. More than enough. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, which I had always found was when trouble preferred to arrive, not on dramatic stormy nights or significant anniversaries, but on the most unremarkable day of the week, when your guard was lowest and you had made the mistake of believing things were settling. It came in the form of 3 wolves. They arrived at the Caerwyn gates mid-morning, announced in advance by a rider the night before, and the entire stronghold shifted in that subtle, collective way that told me this was not a welcome visit, even before anyone said a word. Greta's bread dough got worked harder than necessary. Petra's careful politeness took on a slightly mechanical quality. Even the gray-muzzled dog, whose name I had learned was Corvin, and who was largely indifferent to everything, moved himself from the courtyard to the interior corridor with a slowness that felt deliberate. I asked Wren. "The Aldrich delegation," she said, with the tone of someone identifying a persistent stain. 3 alphas from the Eastern Coalition. They've been requesting an audience for 2 months. Cassian couldn't delay it further, without it becoming an insult that would require a military response. She paused. They are, in the polite sense of the word, difficult. I looked at her. In the less polite sense, she continued, they are the reason 3 smaller packs along the eastern border no longer exist as independent entities. I understood then why Corvin had gone inside. I met them by accident. Sable and I were in the map room, a smaller chamber off the main library that was entirely given over to cartography, with wide, flat drawers of rolled documents and a large tilted table in the center, perfect for spreading things out. She had developed a recent interest in the northern sea routes, tracing the coastline with her finger and asking questions about the settlements marked there. It was the most consecutive speech I had heard from her, and I had been deliberately unhurried, matching her pace, letting the questions lead wherever they wanted. The door opened without a knock. 3 men entered, and the room contracted. That was the only way I could describe it. They were large in the way that certain alphas were large, not just physically but spatially, taking up more than their actual dimensions through sheer force of projected authority. The one in front had a broad, pale face and eyes the color of shallow water, light and cold, and not particularly interested in what they looked at. They stopped when they saw us. Or rather, they stopped when they saw me. The pale-eyed one looked at Sable briefly, dismissively, the way adults look at children they consider furniture. Then his gaze moved to me and stayed there, doing the calculation I recognized immediately, the one that had been run on me my entire life. Omega, unaffiliated, secondary tier, inconsequential. We were told this room was unoccupied, he said, not to me but to the aide hovering behind him. I apologize, Lord Edrin, the aide said quickly. I can find you another. This one is fine. Edrin walked to the far end of the tilted table and leaned over the maps without invitation, as if Sable and I had already ceased to exist. The other 2 spread into the room behind him. One of them, younger, with a restless energy that set something in me on alert, moved close to the table where Sable sat. Too close. The kind of close that wasn't about the maps. Sable had gone completely still. The particular stillness she used when she was afraid. The kind that was so thorough it looked like calm if you didn't know her. Her hands were flat on the map in front of her, and she wasn't breathing quite right. Something in my chest went very quiet and very clear. I moved between her and the young wolf without rushing, just shifted my position naturally, so that I was standing at the edge of the table closest to her, my shoulder at an angle that required him to either step back or make the aggression explicit. He stepped back. Barely, but he stepped back. Edrin had unrolled one of the sea route maps and was making comments to his companion in a low voice, pointing to the northern settlements with a thick finger. Kerwin's claim on these ports is historical, not current. The Aldrich Coalition has maintained active trade there for 3 seasons. Any reasonable reassessment of territorial rights would... Those ports are under Kerwin Treaty protection, I said. Silence. I had not planned to say it. Or perhaps I had, from the moment he walked in. I wasn't certain. Edrin looked up from the map slowly, with the expression of a man who had not been interrupted in a very long time and was not sure he had heard correctly. I beg your pardon. The northern ports. I kept my voice level. They've been under Kerwin Treaty since before the Eastern Coalition was formally established. The historical claim you're describing predates the treaty, which means it's been superseded. I read the documentation last week. It's in the flat drawer second from the left, if you'd like to review it. The room was absolutely still. The young restless wolf had gone carefully neutral. Edrin's pale eyes were on me with a new quality. Not respect, not yet, but the beginning of a recalibration. You are, he said slowly, the Omega Cassian purchased at the Varek auction. I'm Mabel, I said, and the documents are in the second drawer. I didn't tell Cassian what happened. I didn't need to. By the time he met with the Aldrich delegation that afternoon, he had already been informed, by whom I never determined, though I suspected Wren. And when he emerged from the meeting 3 hours later and found me in the eastern courtyard with Sable, who was showing me how she'd discovered that the gray lizards would take small pieces of dried fruit from a still hand, he sat down on the low wall nearby and watched for a while before he said anything. "Edrin called you formidable," he said eventually. I kept my eyes on the lizard inching toward Sable's outstretched palm. I imagine he didn't mean it as a compliment. "He didn't," Cassian said. "I took it as one." Sable made a small triumphant sound as the lizard took the fruit, and for one bright, unguarded second, the corner of her mouth curved upward. Not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, the shape of it, the promise. Cassian saw it. I felt him go still beside me the way the air goes still before something significant. He didn't say anything. He just sat with it, the way you sit with something precious and slightly fragile, afraid that acknowledging it too directly might make it retreat. I understood that feeling exactly. That night, the storm that had been building over the highland for 2 days finally arrived. It announced itself first as a pressure change, a dropping stillness, the air thickening. And then, as a sound at the windows, a low, persistent rush that built gradually to something louder. By midnight, the rain was coming sideways against the stone, and the thunder was moving through the walls as much as the air. I was awake. I had been awake for a while, watching the lightning make brief, sharp maps of the highland through my window, when my door opened. Sable stood in the frame in her nightclothes, hair loose and tangled, eyes wide but dry. She had walked here herself. She hadn't been brought. She had made the decision on her own. I moved to the window seat and made space. She climbed up beside me and pulled her knees to her chest, and we sat together watching the storm come and go in waves across the dark highland, the lightning illuminating the grass in silver-white flashes, the thunder rolling through in long diminishing reverberations. "It's very loud," she said. "Yes," I said. "But it's outside," she said, as if testing the truth of it. "Yes," I said. "It's entirely outside." She leaned very slightly against my arm, just the pressure of her shoulder against mine, small and warm and carefully offered. I didn't move, didn't make it into anything, just stayed. We watched the storm until it tired of itself and moved east toward the coast, leaving behind a washed darkness and the smell of wet earth and the kind of quiet that only exists after loud things have finished. Sable fell asleep against my arm sometime in that after quiet, and I sat very still so as not to disturb her. And outside the window, the highland dripped and settled, and somewhere in the stronghold below us some knot of tension that had been present since I arrived, came very slightly loose. Cassian found us there in the morning. He came to check on Sable. I learned later that her room had been found empty, and Petra had made a brief efficient circuit of the places she was known to go, before knocking quietly at my door. Cassian had come himself rather than send someone, which told me something. He opened the door softly, registered the scene. Sable still asleep against my side, gray morning light filling the window, and stopped. I looked at him over the top of her head. There were no words for a moment. The room held its breath. Something moved through his face that I couldn't fully read, and wasn't sure I should try to. Too layered, too private, too much happening at once. But underneath all of it, clear as the light coming through that window, was something that looked very much like relief, the bone-deep kind. The kind that comes when something you had quietly stopped hoping for turns out to be real after all. He looked at his daughter sleeping against the arm of an omega that no one had wanted. And then he looked at me, and I at him. And the question that had been sitting between us since the night of the auction, unformed, unclaimed, waiting, took one step closer to having a shape. He didn't say anything. He just leaned against the doorframe and stayed. And the morning came in around him. And Sable breathed steadily against my side. And for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I felt something I had no practiced defense against. Safe. Not rescued. Not managed. Not tolerated. Safe. And it terrified me completely. Spring came to the Carewin Highland, the way it always does in places that have known long winters, not gently, not gradually, but in sudden, decisive statements. One morning the frost was still hard on the stones of the eastern courtyard, and the next, the air carried something different, something green and insistent underneath the cold, and the gray lizards reappeared on their warm walls as if they had simply been waiting for permission. Sable noticed before anyone else. She came to my room before dawn with her boots already on and her hair in a lopsided braid she had clearly attempted herself, which was new, and she stood at my door with an expression that was, unmistakably, impatient. "The lizards are back," she said. I looked at her. The boots, the braid, the barely contained energy that had been building in her for weeks, finding its shape and its edges and its voice. And something in my chest performed a slow, complicated movement that I had no clean word for. "Give me 2 minutes," I said. We spent the morning in the courtyard. By the time Greta sent Petra to collect us for breakfast, Sable had named 4 lizards. Provisionally, she was careful to clarify, since she acknowledged they might not return to the same spots consistently, and had begun a small journal of her own, recording the date, the temperature she estimated by feel, and the behavior of each individual. Her handwriting was still a child's handwriting, large and uneven and thoroughly certain of itself. Watching her write, I thought, there she is. There is the person she is going to be. It arrived quietly, that thought, not triumphantly. But it arrived with the solid, unshakable quality of things that are simply true. The Aldrich delegation had left 3 days after the map room incident, and in their wake, something had shifted in the stronghold's atmosphere. The particular tension of that visit, the way it had pressed on everyone, contracted the rooms, changed the quality of ordinary silences, had lifted, and in the space it left behind, things that had been waiting found room to move. Cassian began appearing at breakfast. Not at the formal table in the hall, which was reserved for meetings and pack business, but at the small kitchen table where Sable and I had established our morning routine. The first time, he arrived after us, poured his own tea without asking Greta, and sat at the end of the table with correspondence he was reading. He did not insert himself into the morning. He simply added himself to it. Greta did not comment. She set a plate near his elbow without looking at him, the same way she set things near everyone, with the magnificent impartiality of a woman who had decided long ago that status was irrelevant in her kitchen. Sable looked at her father, then at her porridge, then at the map she had spread beside her bowl. "There are 3 settlements on the northern coast that aren't labeled," she said, to no one in particular. Cassian looked up from his correspondence. "The middle one used to be called Veth. The other 2 were seasonal fishing camps. They didn't have permanent names." Sable considered this seriously. "That seems like an oversight." "It probably was," he said. She picked up her pencil and wrote something in the margin of the map in her large, certain handwriting. I could read it from where I sat. "Name these." Cassian saw it too. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the same architecture Sable had shown in the courtyard with the lizard. The shape of one, the clear intention of one. I looked down at my tea. These mornings accumulated. They built on each other the way small stones build a wall. No single one remarkable, but the structure growing solid and real and present. Sable began directing conversation toward her father with increasing frequency, asking about pack history, about the territories on her maps, about the names of rivers and the reasons certain borders ran where they did. He answered everything with a patience and specificity that told me he had been waiting for these questions and had not wanted to force them. I mostly listened. Occasionally, I asked something that moved the conversation forward when it stalled. Once or twice, I watched Cassian look across the table at me with an expression I was finally, reluctantly, allowing myself to identify correctly. It was the same thing I felt when I looked at him. That was, in its way, the most frightening thing that had happened to me in the Kerwin stronghold. More frightening than the Aldrich delegation. More frightening than the storm. More frightening than the moment I had stood on that platform in the Varric Hall with an entire room of wolves deciding I was worth nothing. Because those fears had been about survival. This one was about something that felt far more irreversible. He asked to walk with me on a Thursday evening in early spring, with the direct simplicity that characterized everything he did. The highland path behind the stronghold ran along the ridge, with the grass on one side and the long view west on the other, the hills folding away in layers of blue and gray toward a horizon that seemed to shift slightly with the light. The wind was present but not aggressive, and the sky held the particular luminous quality of spring evenings, not fully dark but not quite light, the last of the sun still active somewhere below the hills. We walked for a while without talking. I had learned, in my months here, that silence with Cassian was not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of someone who had found, at some point, that most words were less precise than the things they were trying to describe, and had decided to use them only when they could actually do the job. "The Aldrich coalition will push again," he said eventually. "Edrin doesn't give up territory claims without a formal council ruling, and that process takes time." "I know," I said. "I want you to be present at the next meeting." I looked at him. "Not as staff," he said. "Not as Sable's companion. As an advisor, officially." He paused. "You knew that documentation better than half my council. And you moved Edrin. Not completely, but enough." He recalibrated. He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like that available to me." The wind moved through the grass beside us, a long, soft, rushing sound. "I'm an unaffiliated Omega," I said. "Your council will have opinions." "My council has opinions about everything," he said. "I find I've become increasingly selective about which ones I let determine my decisions." I looked out at the folding hills. The sky had deepened to something closer to purple at the edges, and the first star had appeared, faint, preliminary, not yet committed. "Cassian," I said. "Mabel." The way he said my name. I had been trying not to think too directly about the way he said my name for some time now, because thinking about it directly led to other thoughts, and those thoughts led to a vulnerability I had not allowed myself since I was very young, and had learned, with thorough efficiency, that allowing it resulted in being left. "I need to tell you something," I said. "All right. I'm not easy." The word came out rougher than I intended. "I'm not uncomplicated. I spent 3 years without a pack, without stability, without anyone who stayed. And I built myself into someone who functions without those things, because I had to, because the alternative was not functioning at all." I stopped walking. He stopped beside me. "And I have been here for months now, and Sable she is extraordinary. And this place has become something I didn't expect. And you have become something I didn't expect. And I need you to understand that if this, whatever this is between us, if it isn't Mabel, I'm not finished." "I know," he said, "but I want to say something first." I looked at him. The light was doing something generous to his face, the tiredness still there, permanent as stone. But underneath it something that had been present, I realized, since almost the beginning. Something open. Something that had been waiting with extraordinary patience for me to be ready to see it. "I have been alone for 2 years," he said. "Before that, I was alone in a different way, present but not reached. I had forgotten what it was to have someone in a room whose attention I actually wanted. He held my gaze with the same steadiness he brought to everything. I'm not asking you for anything that requires certainty. I know you don't have certainty. I don't have it either. I'm asking for the same thing you gave Sable, just presence, just staying. And I will do the same. The first star had been joined by a second. The hills held the last of the light. You paid $2 for me, I said, and my voice came out softer than I intended. I would have paid everything, he said. Simply, without drama. I breathed, and then I did the thing that frightened me most, which was the only truly brave thing available. I stayed where I was and let it be real. The formal council acknowledgement of my advisory role came 6 weeks later, on a morning when the highland was loud with birds, and Sable was in the courtyard with her lizard journal, and Greta had made something with honey and almonds that she set on the table without explanation. There were objections. 3 council members raised concerns about precedent, about classification, about the impropriety of an unaffiliated Omega holding formal standing in the King's advisory circle. Cassian listened to each objection with his full attention, which was the most unsettling thing you could do to someone making an argument. And then he said quietly, that Mabel of Caerwyn, because that was how he introduced the motion, Mabel of Caerwyn, the name landing in the room like something solid and irrevocable, had demonstrated both the knowledge and the judgment the position required, and that the council's role was to advise him on matters of governance, not on his decisions about who was qualified to do so. Mabel of Caerwyn. I felt it settle on me in the council chamber the way the wool blanket had settled on me that first night in the cart, and it was almost the same feeling. Warmth where cold had been, so long that I had forgotten the difference. The day I think of as the real ending, the real completion of the thing, was not a dramatic day. It was an ordinary Sunday in late spring, with the highland smelling of rain and new grass and Greta's bread baking somewhere below. Sable had laughed. Not the small architecture of a laugh. Not the almost smile I had been watching build for months. A real one. Sudden and bright and entirely unself-conscious. Startled out of her by Cassian attempting to catch one of the gray lizards, to demonstrate something about movement patterns, and failing with increasing absurdity until she dissolved. The sound of it filled the courtyard. Cassian looked up from the ground, where he had ended up on one knee, the lizard having executed a flawless escape, and his expression was, I will never have a precise word for it. It was what a man looks like when something he had quietly grieved as lost turns out to be intact. He looked at Sable laughing, and then he looked at me, and I looked back at him. And the thing between us, that patient, persistent, quietly extraordinary thing, completed itself without ceremony in the bright spring air. In the sound of his daughter laughing, in a courtyard full of lizards and sunlight, and the smell of bread. No dramatic declaration, no fanfare. Just the knowledge, mutual and settled and unambiguous, that this was home. That we had each, by different and difficult roads, arrived at the same place. And that none of us, not Cassian, not Sable, not Mabel of Caerwyn, who had once been sold for $2 in a hall full of wolves who saw nothing worth having, would be leaving. Some things don't end with a door closing. They end with one, finally, opening. And the decision, quiet and complete and permanent, to walk through. We walked through.